Don't run, Amara. It only makes me want to catch you more. The voice was a jagged blade against the back of her neck. Amara stood frozen against a cold marble pillar in the Grand Jose lobby, her skin crawling as Daniel's hand clamped around her wrist. For months, she had been a ghost, hiding in the shadows of Seoul, yet he had found her. Desperation burned in her lungs. She needed an exit, any exit. 20 feet away, a man stepped out of a private elevator. He was a storm in a black suit, radiating a lethal authority that made the air in the lobby turn to ice. Without thinking, Amara ripped her arm from Daniel's grasp and lunged. Her hands found the stranger's lapels, gripping the expensive wool until her knuckles turned white. Before he could speak, she pulled him down and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a kiss of passion, it was a plea for life. The world stopped. Behind them, Daniel's footsteps halted. Around them, 4 men in identical suits reached into their jackets, the metallic click of safeties being disengaged echoing through the hall. Amara pulled back, her breath hitching. The stranger's eyes were dark, intense, and absolutely still. He didn't pull away. Instead, he raised a single palm, and the armed guards froze mid-motion. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that carried the weight of an executioner. "But you just stepped into my world. And I don't think I'm going to let you step back out. Before I take you back to the moment everything I trusted collapsed, I need to ask you for something simple. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your city. Your country. Even if it's just a quiet room where no one knows your name. Because this story lived in silence for a long time, and I want to know how far my voice finally travels. If stories about betrayal behind closed doors, power hidden beneath grief, and women who refuse to stay broken speak to you, please like this video and subscribe. It may seem small, but this is how stories like this survive. This is how truth finds witnesses. What I'm about to share didn't begin with violence or chaos. It began with fear. With a choice made in desperation. With a single kiss meant to be an escape. She thought it would end there. But some doors don't close once they've been opened. This is a story about trust weaponized. About loyalty traded like currency. About the kind of danger that doesn't arrive screaming, but watches, waits, and decides you belong to it. I never imagined I would be the one telling this story. But once you hear how it truly began, how one moment of survival became a lifelong consequence, you'll understand why silence was no longer an option. The morning sun filtered through the narrow windows of Amara's small apartment, but the light brought no warmth, only a stark clarity to the bruises blooming on her wrists. She sat at her kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug of lukewarm coffee cradled in her hands, listening to the muffled sounds of Seoul waking up outside. For the first time in months, the air in the room didn't feel heavy with Daniel's presence. The lobby incident had worked. The terror in Daniel's eyes when he saw the men in black suits had bought her a temporary, fragile peace. But as the caffeine hit her bloodstream, the memory of the stranger's lips on hers flooded back, accompanied by the chilling weight of his raised hand and the silent obedience of his armed guards. She didn't even know his name, yet she had used him as a shield in a game where the stakes were life and death. She was an outsider in this city, a woman fleeing a monster, and she had just handed her life over to a dragon. A sharp, rhythmic rapping at her door shattered the silence. Amara's heart lunged against her ribs, the familiar, cold dread of Daniel's return washing over her. She stood up, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy cast-iron skillet on the counter. "I told you to stay away, Daniel," she shouted, her voice trembling but fierce. "I'll call the police." "We are not Daniel," a deep, calm voice replied through the wood. "And the police are currently occupied with the chairman's business." The lock clicked, not from a key, but from a professional bypass. Amara stepped back, her breath hitching as the door swung open. 2 men stood in the hallway, dressed in identical charcoal suits that cost more than her entire year's rent. They didn't look like Daniel's unhinged associates, they looked like shadows carved from granite. "Ms. Amara Wells," the man on the right stated. It wasn't a question. "Chairman Seo Min-Jun is waiting." I don't know who that is," Amara lied, her fingers tightening on the skillet. "You knew him well enough to claim him in front of his board of directors last night," the man replied, stepping into her living room with a terrifyingly polite grace. The chairman doesn't like unfinished business. He says you ran out before the bill was settled. The bill. The word made her stomach turn. She had thought the kiss was an escape, a desperate gambit to save her skin for one more night. She hadn't realized she had entered into a contract with the underworld. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice rising. Tell your chairman that I'm sorry for the mistake. It was a moment of desperation. Desperation is the currency the chairman deals in most, the man said, gesturing toward the door. He has already cleared your debt with Mr. Cross. Daniel is no longer a factor you need to worry about this morning. But that protection has a price, and the chairman prefers to collect in person. Amara looked at her open door, then at the two men who stood like pillars of inevitable fate. She realized then that Daniel had been a local storm, but Seo Min-Jun was the entire ocean. She set the skillet down on the counter, her shoulders slumping. She had spent months hiding from a man who wanted to break her, and now she was being collected by a man who intended to own her. She didn't change her clothes. She walked out of her apartment in her simple white top and fitted jeans, feeling small and exposed as she was led to a black sedan idling at the curb. As the car pulled away from the curb, Amara looked back at her building, realizing that the safety she had prayed for had finally arrived, and it was wearing a sharp suit and a dragon tattoo. The chill of the morning had not yet dissipated when Amara found herself standing in the center of her small apartment, the door still vibrating from the weight of Min-Jun's men who had just departed. The silence that followed their collection notice was not peaceful, it was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. She looked down at her hands, which were still trembling, and then at the window where the black sedan had disappeared into the gray, early morning traffic of Seoul. She was trapped between two monsters, one who used chaos and another who used absolute, crushing order. She knew she couldn't stay in the apartment. Even if Min-Jun's men claimed Daniel was no longer a factor this morning, she knew Daniel better than anyone. He was a man of erratic, loud violence, a person who didn't understand the concept of a tactical retreat, only a temporary pause to gather more venom. The lobby incident hadn't just humiliated him, it had stripped away his perceived ownership of her in a public, lethal arena. For a man like Daniel, who saw Amara as a trophy to be kept on a high shelf, that was a death sentence for his ego. Amara moved with a frantic, localized energy, throwing essentials into a worn backpack. She grabbed her passport, her extra cash, and the one small sketch of her grandmother she had managed to save from Daniel's last explosive rage. She had to get to the airport. She had to vanish back into the world before the bill from the Mafia king became something she was forced to pay with her soul. As she reached for her keys on the kitchen counter, a soft, scratching sound came from the hallway outside. It wasn't the rhythmic, heavy rapping of the men in charcoal suits, it was a desperate, familiar scraping, like a predator trying to find a loose board in a fence. Amara. I know you're in there, baby. The voice was a low, jagged rasp that sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. Daniel. He hadn't waited for the chairman's protection to expire. He had bypassed whatever perimeter Min-Jun had set, driven by an obsessive need to reclaim what he believed was his. Daniel, go away. Amara shouted, her back against the kitchen counter, her fingers searching for the cast-iron skillet she had only just set down. The police. The police won't help you with him, Amara. You think that suit-wearing freak is your savior? Daniel's voice rose, the erratic pitch signaling the peak of a manic episode. A heavy thud shook the door, his shoulder slamming against the wood. I saw how you looked at him. I saw how you let him touch you. You're mine, Amara. Do you think you can just kiss a stranger and erase us? The wood groaned. Daniel wasn't using a professional bypass, he was using the brute force of a man who had lost his mind. Amara scrambled toward the bathroom, the only room with a lock that might hold for more than a few seconds. She slammed the door shut and slid the bolt home, her breath coming in shallow, terrified hitches. Open the door, Amara. We're going home. I've already packed your things at the other place. The sound of the front door splintering echoed through the small apartment. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her knees to her chest as she sat on the cold tile floor. This was the escalation she had feared, the loud, violent crash of her past refusing to stay buried. Daniel was in the living room now. She could hear him throwing her chairs, the sound of her mug of lukewarm coffee shattering against the floor. "Where are you hiding, you little bird?" he crooned, his voice dripping with a terrifying, false sweetness. "You think a kiss makes you a queen? You're a runner, Amara. That's all you'll ever be." The bathroom door handle rattled violently. Amara gripped the skillet, her knuckles white. She was an outsider, a ghost in this city, and she realized in that moment that Min-Jun's protection wasn't just a gilded cage, it was the only thing standing between her and a shallow grave. Suddenly, the shouting stopped. The rattling of the handle ceased. A heavy silence descended over the apartment, broken only by the sound of muffled, rapid footsteps and a sickening, wet thud that Amara felt through the floorboards. "Ms. Wells." The voice was deep, smooth, and entirely wrong for the chaos of the room. It wasn't Daniel. It was the calm authority of the dragon. "Ms. Wells, the chairman is not a patient man. He sent us back to ensure your safety was not compromised by your lack of cooperation." Amara waited, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slowly slid the bolt back and opened the door. The two men in charcoal suits were standing in her living room, their expressions as unreadable as granite. On the floor, Daniel was pinned beneath the boot of a third man she hadn't seen before. Daniel's face was pressed into the rug, his eyes wide with a shock that had finally replaced his rage. "The chairman considers your debt to be exclusive," the lead man stated, adjusting his cufflink. "Mr. Cross has committed the error of interfering with an asset of the Seo syndicate. This is the first and final escalation we will permit from his side." The man looked at Amara, his gaze lingering on her white top and jeans, the clothes of an outsider who was now irrevocably pulled into a lethal world. "He's not dead?" Amara whispered, her voice a hollow shell. "Not yet," the man replied. "But his presence in this city is no longer authorized. We are taking you to the chairman's estate now. You will not be given a second opportunity to decline the invitation." As they led her out of the ruined apartment, Amara looked back at Daniel. He looked small, broken, and insignificant compared to the crushing, silent power of the men holding him. She realized then that the kiss in the lobby hadn't just saved her from a wolf, it had marked her as the property of a dragon who refused to let her go. The black sedan was waiting at the curb again. As the door was held open for her, Amara didn't look for an exit. She climbed inside, the heavy click of the door sealing her into a world where her past was a shadow and her future was a debt to be settled in person. The transition from the frantic, jagged chaos of her ruined apartment to the heavy, soundproofed luxury of the black sedan felt like a surgical removal of her old life. Amara sat in the back seat, her backpack clutched against her chest as if it were the only anchor left in a world that had suddenly dissolved into a sea of dark-tinted glass and expensive leather. Beside her, the man in the charcoal suit remained a silent, granite statue, his presence a reminder that her safety was no longer a right she possessed, but a loan from a man who expected a high return on his investment. As the car glided through the bustling streets of Seoul, Amara felt the city she had tried so hard to blend into becoming a distant, blurred memory. The car began to climb a winding, private road away from the city's heart, the buildings replaced by high stone walls topped with electronic sensors and wrought iron gates that opened with a silent, heavy authority. When the sedan finally came to a halt, the door was opened for her by another man who looked exactly like the one she had just spent an hour with, silent, professional, and dangerous. Amara stepped out, her fitted jeans and simple white top feeling like a costume from a past life as she stood before the Seo estate. It was a monolith of modern glass and dark timber, an architectural marvel that breathed a suffocating sense of power and absolute isolation. "Welcome to your sanctuary, Ms. Wells," the lead man stated, his tone as unreadable as the marble floors of the foyer they entered. Amara didn't feel like she was in a sanctuary, she felt like she was being walked into a vault. The interior was a masterpiece of cold opulence, soaring ceilings, minimalist art that looked like frozen screams, and a silence so deep it made her own heartbeat sound like a drum. Every surface was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting her exhausted, terrified face back at her in a dozen different angles. She was a ghost in a house of giants, an outsider who had been collected and filed away behind biometric locks. She was led to a suite on the upper floor that was larger than her entire apartment building. The walls were draped in heavy silks, and the floor was covered in rugs so thick they swallowed the sound of her footsteps. On the bed, a collection of high-end designer boxes had been laid out, filled with clothes that were meant to replace the casual, worn items she had arrived in. "The chairman expects you for dinner at 8, the man said, standing by the door. "He has requested that you wear the black dress. It has been tailored to your measurements." "Measurements?" Amara's voice was a thin, jagged rasp. "How do you have my measurements?" "The chairman is thorough," was the only response before the door clicked shut, the sound of the lock engaging echoing through the cavernous room. Amara sank onto the edge of the bed, her backpack sliding to the floor. She looked at the black dress, a sleek, silk garment that looked like spilled ink. It was a gilded cage, just as she had feared. Min-Jun hadn't just saved her from Daniel, he had replaced Daniel's erratic, violent ownership with a systematic, all-encompassing claim. Daniel wanted to break her, but Min-Jun wanted to curate her. He wanted the woman who had used his kiss as an escape to become a permanent fixture of his world, a debt that would never be fully paid. She spent the afternoon wandering the suite, testing the windows only to find they were made of reinforced ballistic glass that didn't even vibrate when she pounded on it. There was no exit, no secret passage, no way back to the woman who had walked into the Grand Jose lobby with a simple plan for survival. She was an asset of the Seo syndicate now, a piece of property that had been reclaimed from the trash and placed in a velvet-lined box. As 8 o'clock approached, Amara changed into the black dress. It fit her like a second skin, the fabric cool and heavy, marking the transformation from a runner to a consort. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror, her dark skin glowing against the silk, but her eyes were heavy with a fatigue that no amount of luxury could wash away. She was a survivor at a turning point, standing on the edge of a world that was as dangerous as it was beautiful. The doors were opened by 2 guards, and she was led down a grand staircase to a dining room that overlooked the lights of Seoul far below. Min-Jun was already there, standing by a massive window with a glass of dark liquid in his hand. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, his sharp facial structure caught in the low, moody lighting of the room. The dragon tattoo was hidden beneath his crisp white shirt, but Amara could feel the power he radiated like heat, a man used to control without effort. He didn't speak as she entered, he simply watched her, his gaze assessing and intense. He was possessive and calculating, a predator who had caught his prey and was now deciding how to savor it. Amara stood her ground, her posture upright and guarded, refusing to lean into the protection he offered. She was here to settle the bill, but she realized as she looked into his dark, dangerous eyes that the price was going to be her entire life. "You look exactly as I imagined you would," Min-Jun said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that made the air in the room feel thin. "The stranger's kiss was a bold opening move, Amara. But in my world, every move has a countermove." "I did what I had to do to survive," Amara replied, her voice steadying as her reactive survival instinct took hold. "And I am doing what I must to ensure what is mine is not damaged," Min-Jun countered, stepping closer until he dominated her space. He didn't force contact, but his proximity was a threat and a promise all at once. "Daniel Cross is a ghost. You are here. Those are the only facts that matter tonight." Amara looked at him, the man who refused to let her go, and realized that the safety of the Seo estate was a permanent sentence. She had escaped a monster only to be claimed by a king, and as they sat down to a dinner that felt like a ritual of ownership, she knew that the war for her freedom had only just moved into a much more elegant arena. The heavy silence of the dining room was broken only by the rhythmic clinking of silver against fine porcelain, a sound that felt as sharp as a heartbeat in the cavernous space. Amara sat across from Seo Min-Jun, her silk dress rustling with every shallow breath she took, the fabric feeling like a cool, dark weight against her skin. The dinner was a masterclass in quiet intimidation, the food was exquisite, yet it tasted like ash in her mouth as she watched the man who had effectively annexed her life. Min-Jun ate with a terrifyingly calm precision, his sharp facial structure illuminated by the low, moody glow of the chandeliers. He didn't look like a man recovering from a surgery or a hit, he looked like a predator who had just finished arranging his world to his exact specifications. "You aren't eating, Amara," Min-Jun noted, his gaze lifting from his plate to fix on her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thin. "It's difficult to find an appetite when I'm waiting for the next cage to drop," Amara replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Min-Jun's lips curved into a slight, dangerous smile, a gesture that was more about possession than warmth. A cage is only a cage if you try to fly through the bars. If you stay in the center, it is a fortress. He set his napkin down with a finality that signaled the end of the meal. But I understand your hesitation. You have lived in fear for so long that you no longer recognize the difference between a threat and a solution. He stood up, the movement fluid and dominant, and gestured toward the door. Come. It is time you understood the nature of the world you entered when you kissed me. Amara followed him, her heels clicking against the marble floors like a countdown. They didn't return to the upper floors of the estate. Instead, they descended into the lower levels, where the elegant timber and glass were replaced by industrial steel and concrete. The atmosphere shifted from opulence to utility, a cold, sterile environment where the true machinery of the Seo syndicate operated out of sight. Min-Jun led her into a darkened observation room, one wall made entirely of one-way glass. On the other side of the glass was a small, brightly lit chamber. In the center, Daniel Cross was strapped to a chair, his face a swollen map of bruises and desperation. He was no longer the erratic, loud monster who had terrorized Amara for months. He looked small, broken, and utterly insignificant beneath the cold glare of the overhead lights. Two of Min-Jun's men stood behind him, their expressions as unreadable as granite. Amara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she pressed against the cold glass. What are you doing to him? He is a problem, Amara, Min-Jun said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet as he stood behind her, his presence radiating a lethal heat. And in my world, problems are not discussed. They are solved. He reached out, his hand hovering near the small of her back, not forcing contact but marking his territory with absolute authority. He followed you. He breached my perimeter. He attempted to reclaim what has been designated as mine. Through the glass, she saw one of the guards lean down, whispering something into Daniel's ear. Daniel's eyes widened, darting toward the glass as if he could sense her standing there. He began to thrash, a muffled scream escaping his lips, but the straps held him firm. You're going to kill him, Amara whispered, her eyes filling with a mixture of horror and a dark, primal relief she hated herself for feeling. Death is a release, Amara. He doesn't deserve release yet, Min-Jun replied, his gaze fixed on Daniel with a calculating intensity. He needs to understand the scale of his error. He needs to realize that the woman he thought he owned is now protected by a dragon. Min-Jun signaled to the guards. One of them produced a small, silver briefcase, opening it to reveal a set of high-end electronic devices. He used your phone to track you, Min-Jun explained, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing a business merger. So, we have spent the last hour erasing him from the digital world. His accounts are gone. His records are deleted. To the world, Daniel Cross no longer exists. The guard pressed a button on a tablet, and Daniel let out a fresh, agonized howl as a high-frequency pulse was directed into his headset. Amara winced, the sound, even muffled by the glass, vibrating through her bones. This is the lesson, Amara, Min-Jun said, turning her toward him so she was forced to look into his dark, dangerous eyes. I do not use loud violence unless it is necessary. I use absolute, crushing order. He gripped her shoulders, his touch deliberate and possessive. You used me as an escape. I accepted that move. But now you must understand that my protection is not a passive act. It is a total claim. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. Daniel will be moved to a facility in the north. He will never see the sun again, and he will certainly never see you. Min-Jun pulled back, searching her face for a reaction. Amara stood upright, her posture guarded, her eyes heavy with the weight of the transformation she was undergoing. She had escaped a wolf only to be claimed by a dragon, and the price of her safety was the total erasure of her past life. Are you satisfied? Min-Jun asked, his voice a low challenge. Amara looked back at the glass, at the man who had nearly broken her, now reduced to a whimpering shadow. I'm terrified, she admitted, her voice a hollow shell. Good, Min-Jun said, his hand sliding up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing a faint tear track near her eye. Fear is a healthy reaction to power. But as long as you belong to me, that power is your shield. He led her out of the observation room, the heavy steel door sealing Daniel away in his concrete tomb. As they ascended back into the silent, cold opulence of the main house, Amara realized that the lesson wasn't just about Daniel. It was about her. She was no longer a victim fleeing a monster, she was a consort of the Seoul underworld, a woman whose safety was tied to a man who refused to let her go. The gilded cage had just become much smaller, and the bars were made of the very protection she had prayed for. As Min-Jun walked her back to her suite, his presence a stabilizing yet dangerous force, Amara knew that the outsider she used to be was dead. In her place stood a woman who had used a stranger's kiss to survive, only to find that the stranger had become her entire world. The days inside the Seo estate had a way of bleeding into one another, a seamless loop of quiet luxury and suffocating watchfulness that made Amara feel like a specimen preserved in amber. She spent her hours wandering the sprawling, minimalist halls, her footsteps swallowed by thick rugs, her reflection haunting the polished marble surfaces like a ghost that didn't know it was dead. The designer clothes Min-Jun provided felt like silk armor, beautiful and expensive, but they were a constant reminder that her old life, the jeans, the white tops, the simple struggle for autonomy, had been effectively erased by the dragon's claim. Min-Jun himself was a flickering shadow in her periphery, a man who radiated a lethal, stabilizing heat whenever he appeared for dinner or a brief, intense conversation in the library. Her new phone sat on the mahogany nightstand, a sleek, encrypted device provided by Min-Jun's security team. It was supposed to be her only lifeline, a secure channel that connected her to the estate's grid and nothing else. Min-Jun had assured her that her digital footprint was gone, that Daniel Cross had been deleted from the world and replaced by a void. But Amara knew that monsters like Daniel didn't just vanish, they left echoes in the static, jagged fragments of obsession that could cut through even the most expensive firewalls. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the Seoul skyline in bruised purples and golds, when the phone vibrated. It wasn't the rhythmic chime of the estate's intercom. It was a sharp, persistent buzzing that felt invasive, like an insect trapped under glass. Amara stared at the screen. The caller ID was a string of scrambled characters, a digital glitch that shouldn't have been able to bypass the Seo Syndicate's security. Her hand trembled as she picked up the device, her reactive survival instinct screaming at her to throw it against the ballistic glass windows. But the curiosity, the dark pull of her past, was stronger. She slid the bar to answer, pressing the cool glass against her ear. Silence greeted her, a heavy, breathing silence that smelled of stale cigarettes and unhinged desperation. "You look beautiful in black, Amara." The voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the sterile peace of the suite. It was Daniel. Somehow, despite the concrete tomb Min-Jun had promised, despite the digital erasure, he had found a crack. The erratic pitch of his voice suggested he was deep in the throes of a manic escalation, the kind that usually ended in shattered glass and bruises. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice a hollow shell. "How are you doing this? You're supposed to be dead? Gone? Deleted?" Daniel's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound that made her skin crawl. "You think a suit and a tattoo can hide you from me? I'm the only one who knows the real you, Amara. Not the doll he's dressing up in silk. I know the girl who runs. I know the girl who's scared of the dark." Amara stood up, her back hitting the silk-draped wall as she looked frantically at the heavy oak door. "He'll find you, Daniel. He told me you were moved. He told me you were solved." "Solved?" Daniel hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. "He just moved me to a different playground, baby. He thinks he can lock me away, but I have friends he doesn't know about. Friends who don't like dragons." There was a wet, slapping sound on the other end, followed by a grunt of pain that wasn't Daniel's. "I'm coming for you, Amara. I'm going to burn that gilded cage down, and I'm going to take back what belongs to me." The line went dead, the silence of the room returning with a crushing weight. Amara dropped the phone, the device clattering onto the rug like a live grenade. Her heart was a drum, her breathing shallow and frantic. The lesson in power she had witnessed in the observation room had been a lie, or at least an incomplete truth. Daniel wasn't a ghost, he was a shark circling the fortress, and he had just tasted blood. She lunged for the door, her silk dress rustling as she threw it open, nearly colliding with the two guards who stood like granite pillars in the hallway. "I need to see him," she gasped, her eyes wide with a shock that had finally broken her guarded composure. "I need to see Min-Jun. Now." They led her down to the library, where Min-Jun was seated at a massive mahogany desk, his sharp facial structure caught in the low, moody lighting of the room. He looked up as she burst in, his gaze assessing her disheveled state with a calculating intensity. He didn't look surprised, he looked as if he had been waiting for the first crack to appear in the sanctuary he had built. "He called me," Amara said, her voice a thin rasp as she leaned against the desk for support. "Daniel. He found the number. He said he's coming for me." Min-Jun didn't flinch. He slowly set down his pen, his dark, intense eyes locking onto hers. "The number was encrypted, Amara. To bypass it requires more than the erratic ramblings of a broken man." He stood up, the movement fluid and dominant, his presence radiating a stabilizing yet dangerous power. "It means the council is testing my claim. It means your ex-boyfriend has become a pawn for men far more dangerous than himself." He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her, his proximity a threat and a promise all at once. He didn't touch her, but he dominated her space, his gaze heavy with a possessive authority. "You were worried about the price of my protection, Amara. Now you see why it is so high." "He's going to kill us," she whispered, the reactive survival instinct that had led her to kiss a stranger now urging her to run until her lungs burst. "No," Min-Jun countered, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that made the air feel solid again. "He is going to provide me with the opportunity to finish what I started. He is the erratic noise that allows me to justify the silence I am about to create." He reached out, his hand sliding up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing the faint mark near her eye that signaled her trauma. "I told you I refused to let you go, Amara. That includes letting you go back to a monster." He turned to the lead guard standing by the door. "Double the perimeter. I want a sweep of the digital grid. Find the breach, and find who Daniel is talking to." He looked back at Amara, his expression one of intense, controlled possessiveness. "You will stay in the inner sanctum tonight. No phones. No windows. Just me." Amara looked into the eyes of the Mafia boss and realized that the phone call hadn't just brought Daniel back, it had officially ended her life as an outsider. She was the center of a war she didn't understand, a woman whose stranger's kiss had turned her into the ultimate asset of the Seoul underworld. The gilded cage was tightening, and as Min-Jun led her deeper into the heart of his estate, she knew that the only way to survive the echoes of her past was to fully embrace the dragon of her present. The echoes of Daniel's voice still rattled in her mind, a jagged reminder that her freedom was a ghost. But as she walked beside the man who refused to let her go, Amara felt a dark, irreversible transformation taking root. She was no longer just a runner, she was the reason for a dragon's fire. The velvet weight of the evening gown Min-Jun had chosen for her felt like a second skin, one that was far more restrictive than the simple white top and jeans she had worn when this nightmare began. Amara stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her suite, staring at a woman she barely recognized. The dress was a deep, shimmering emerald, the color of a predator's eyes in the dark, and it clung to her curves with a possessive precision. Her long, sleek hair was styled to perfection, cascading over one shoulder to partially obscure the faint mark near her eye, the physical ghost of Daniel's obsession that refused to fade. She looked calm, but her expression remained emotionally guarded, her eyes heavy with the weight of the transformation she was undergoing. She wasn't just a guest tonight, she was the centerpiece of a lethal stage. Min-Jun had been clear during their brief meeting in the inner sanctum. The Seoul Heritage Gala was not an event, it was an extraction. Daniel's phone call had proven that he was being moved as a pawn by rival factions within the syndicate, and Min-Jun intended to use Amara as the bait that would snap the trap shut. The plan was high stakes and rapid, a tactical gamble that relied on Daniel's unhinged inability to see her in another man's arms without losing his mind. "You are the flame, Amara," Min-Jun had said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet as he adjusted the emerald necklace around her throat, his fingers lingering on her skin with a stabilizing yet dangerous heat. "Daniel is the moth. And tonight, we end his flight." As the black sedan glided toward the grand venue, the city of Seoul blurred past the ballistic glass like a dream she was waking up from. Beside her, Min-Jun sat in a tailored tuxedo, his sharp facial structure caught in the passing streetlights, his intensity controlled and absolute. He didn't look like a man leading a woman into a war zone, he looked like a king preparing to claim what was his in front of his enemies. The gala was a swirl of blinding flashbulbs, clinking champagne flutes, and the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and hidden agendas. Amara felt like an outsider as they entered the grand hall, the marble floors and chandeliers echoing the cold opulence of the Seo estate. Min-Jun's hand remained firmly on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that signaled his authority to every person in the room. He navigated the social waters with a calculating grace, introducing Amara as his companion while his eyes never stopped scanning the crowd for the erratic noise of her past. For hours, the tension simmered beneath the surface of polite conversation and orchestral music. Amara played her part, standing upright but not relaxed, her posture suggesting a woman who was being held rather than choosing to lean in. She was the silent truth in the center of the room, the woman who had used a stranger's kiss to survive and was now the reason for a dragon's fire. The shift happened when they moved toward the terrace overlooking the gardens. The lighting was low and moody, the soft shadows providing the intimacy Daniel would find irresistible. Amara felt the prickle of eyes on her, not the assessing, cold gazes of the syndicate elite, but the hot, frantic stare of a predator who had lost his mind. "He's here," she whispered, her voice a hollow shell as she leaned slightly into Min-Jun. Min-Jun didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze focused downward toward her with a possessive, protective intensity. "I know. The perimeter has already been breached. Let him come, Amara. Let him see what happens when a ghost tries to touch the living." A shadow detached itself from the manicured shrubbery at the edge of the terrace. Daniel Cross stepped into the light, his tuxedo disheveled, his eyes wide and bloodshot with a manic escalation that had finally reached its peak. He looked unhinged, a sharp contrast to the silent, crushing dominance of the man standing beside Amara. "Amara! Get away from him!" Daniel screamed, his voice a jagged blade that shattered the elegant atmosphere of the gala. He lunged forward, his movement erratic and loud, a desperate animal trying to reclaim a trophy. The reaction was instantaneous. Min-Jun's men, who had been blended into the crowd as granite pillars of security, stepped out from the shadows. They didn't draw their weapons yet, they simply formed a wall of charcoal suits between the predator and his prey. Min-Jun didn't move to protect himself, he simply raised a single palm, an absolute command that froze the violence in midair. "You were a mistake I chose to correct, Daniel," Min-Jun said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that carried the weight of an executioner. "You dared to touch what is mine. You dared to interfere with my debt." Daniel was pinned by the guards, his thrashing reduced to a whimpering struggle as he realized the scale of the trap he had walked into. He looked at Amara, his expression one of betrayal and obsessive rage. "You used him. You used him to kill me." Amara looked at the man who had terrorized her for months, now a broken shadow in a tuxedo. She stood upright, her gaze steady, finally finding the center of the cage she had built for herself. "I used a kiss to escape you, Daniel. I used the truth to survive you." Min-Jun leaned down, his proximity to Amara a threat and a promise as he watched Daniel be dragged away into the dark. The extraction was complete, the erratic noise of her past finally silenced by the crushing order of the dragon. But as the gala trap snapped shut, Amara realized that the safety Min-Jun offered was irreversible. She was no longer a runner, she was the consort of the Seoul underworld, and Min-Jun's refusal to let her go was the only thing standing between her and the shadows. "The bill is settled, Amara," Min-Jun whispered, his thumb brushing her jaw in a possessive claim. "Now, we begin the rest of your life." As they walked back through the grand hall, the flashbulbs continuing to pop, Amara Wells knew that the outsider she used to be was gone. She was the dragon's queen, and the fire was only just beginning. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax was suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder and the smell of ozone. The grand hall of the Seoul Heritage Gala, which only moments ago had been a cathedral of silent power and polite manipulation, erupted into a discordant symphony of shattering crystal and human panic. Amara felt the world tilt as Min-Jun's hand, previously a warm weight on her lower back, suddenly became a vice-like grip that jerked her behind the solid mass of his body. Daniel had not been fully removed. The extraction that Min-Jun had orchestrated was a trap that had caught the moth, but the moth had brought a flame of its own. Daniel Cross had broken free from the charcoal-suited guards, his manic escalation fueled by a desperate, unhinged energy that defied the crushing order of the Seo syndicate. He didn't have a tactical plan, he had a stolen firearm and a singular, jagged obsession that saw Amara as a prize to be reclaimed or destroyed. You think he's a god, Amara? I'll show you he bleeds like the rest of us. Daniel's scream was a jagged blade that cut through the orchestral music, which had devolved into a low, dying groan as the musicians fled. Daniel lunged from behind a marble pillar, his movement erratic and loud, a sharp contrast to the silent, predatory grace of the man standing in front of Amara. He fired blindly into the crowd, the muzzle flash illuminating his bloodshot eyes and the sweat-drenched mess of his tuxedo. The first bullet struck a massive chandelier, sending a rain of glass down onto the white marble floors, the same floors where Amara had once stood as a casual outsider, now a target in an emerald gown. Min-Jun didn't flinch. His sharp facial structure remained set in a mask of calculating intensity, his eyes fixed on Daniel with the focused gaze of a dragon watching a nuisance. He didn't pull a weapon immediately, instead, he raised his palm in that singular, authoritative gesture that signaled his command over the chaos. Minho. Sector 4. Min-Jun's voice was a deep, smooth velvet that carried effortlessly over the screams. The guards who had been standing like granite pillars around the room moved in perfect, lethal synchronization. They didn't panic, they simply began to close the circle around Daniel, their charcoal suits absorbing the shadows of the hall. But Daniel was no longer acting within the bounds of logic. He fired again, the round clipping the marble floor inches from where Amara stood, her heels digging into the rug as she fought the impulsive survival instinct to run into the dark. Blood began to mar the pristine white marble, not Amara's, and not yet Daniel's, but the blood of those caught in the erratic noise of his past. The sight of the red stains spreading across the luxury hotel floor triggered a wave of nausea in Amara, a physical manifestation of the trauma that had followed her across the ocean. She looked at Min-Jun, whose hand was now gripping the railing of the grand staircase, his presence a stabilizing yet dangerous heat that refused to let her go. Stay down, Amara, Min-Jun commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. Daniel was screaming her name, a hollow shell of the man who had once pretended to love her. He was scrambling toward them, slipping on the spilled champagne and the glass fragments, his erratic violence making him a ghost of the man he used to be. He raised the gun one last time, aiming directly at Min-Jun's chest, the space where the dragon tattoo was hidden beneath his crisp white shirt. If I can't have you, he doesn't get to keep you. Daniel roared, his voice hitting a manic peak. The sound of the final shot was different, clean, sharp, and absolute. It wasn't Daniel's gun. Min-Jun had finally made his move, a tactical gamble that ended the erratic noise of Amara's past once and for all. Daniel stumbled back, the weapon falling from his hand and clattering onto the marble with a sound that signaled the end of his flight. He looked down at the red blooming on his own chest, his expression one of shock and a final, devastating realization that he had never stood a chance against the dragon. Daniel collapsed onto the marble, his blood mixing with the champagne and the glass shards. He was a broken shadow, a piece of trash that had been removed by the crushing order of the Seo syndicate. Amara stood frozen, her eyes heavy with the weight of the violence she had just witnessed, her emerald dress reflecting the moody, warm lighting of the hall. Min-Jun turned to her, his intensity controlled and absolute. He reached out, his hand sliding up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing the faint mark near her eye as he assessed her for any damage. The noise is over, Amara, he whispered, his voice a smooth velvet that made the air in the room feel thin. Amara looked at the blood on the marble, then up at the Mafia boss who had claimed her as his own. She realized then that the safety she had used a stranger's kiss to find was bought with the total erasure of the man she had once feared. She was no longer a runner, she was the woman at the center of the dragon's war, and the price of his protection was irreversible. You killed him, she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. I corrected a mistake, Min-Jun countered, his possessive claim tightening as he led her away from the wreckage toward the waiting black sedan. Daniel Cross is gone. You belong to the Seo house now. That is the only fact that survives tonight. As they walked through the hotel lobby, past the guards who raised their guns only to be stilled by Min-Jun's palm, Amara Wells knew the outsider she used to be was buried under the marble. The gilded cage had been sealed in blood, and as the car glided away into the Seoul night, she knew there was no going back. The aftermath of the gala felt like a funeral for a woman who hadn't yet stopped breathing. Amara sat in the back of the black sedan, the emerald silk of her gown feeling like a cold, wet second skin against her trembling limbs. Beside her, Seo Min-Jun was a silent, lethal presence, his sharp facial structure silhouetted against the neon blur of the Seoul night. He didn't offer comfort, and he didn't offer apologies, he only offered the crushing, silent order that had become her entire world. The blood on the marble was a stain she could still see whenever she closed her eyes, a red map of the final escalation that had ended her life as an outsider. But as the car bypassed the main gates of the estate and descended into the industrial levels beneath the timber and glass, Amara realized the finality of the gala had been another calculation. Daniel Cross was not dead, not yet. Min-Jun had corrected the mistake of Daniel's interference, but he had reserved the final stroke for the person who had started the game with a stranger's kiss. The elevator doors opened to the same sterile, brightly lit chamber she had seen before. The air here was thin, metallic, and heavy with the scent of ozone and impending consequence. Daniel was there, strapped to the same chair, though his tuxedo was now a ruined rag and the red blooming on his chest had been crudely bandaged by Min-Jun's medics. He looked like a ghost of the monster he had once been, his manic energy replaced by a hollow, flickering terror as he stared at the two of them. Min-Jun stepped forward, his sharp suit immaculate despite the violence of the evening. He stood with absolute authority, his gaze focused downward on the broken man with a calculating intensity. He reached into the small of his back and pulled a sleek, black handgun from its holster, the metallic click of the safety being disengaged echoing like a gavel in the silence of the room. He didn't fire. Instead, he turned to Amara and held the weapon out, the grip offered toward her with a stabilizing yet dangerous heat. "He is the erratic noise that has kept you running, Amara," Min-Jun said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that made the cold concrete room feel even smaller. "He is the shadow that made you choose me. But a dragon does not keep a woman who is afraid of her own past." Amara looked at the gun, then at Min-Jun's dark, intense eyes. This was the killing choice, the final outcome of the transformation she had undergone since the night in the lobby. Min-Jun wasn't just asking her to kill a man, he was asking her to kill the victim she used to be. He was demanding that she prove she belonged to the Seo house not because she was caught, but because she was capable of the same crushing order he wielded. "You want me to do it?" she whispered, her voice a thin, jagged rasp that she barely recognized. "I want you to be free," Min-Jun countered, his possessive claim radiating from him as he moved closer, his proximity a threat and a promise all at once. "Freedom in my world is not the absence of walls, Amara. It is the power to decide who lives and dies within them." Amara took the weapon. It was heavier than she expected, the cold steel a stark contrast to the shimmering silk of her emerald gown. She stepped toward the glass, toward the man who had systematically broken her down piece by piece until she was a ghost in her own life. Daniel's eyes found hers. He began to thrash, a muffled, gurgling plea escaping his lips, but the straps held him as firmly as the Seo syndicate held the city. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a possession he had lost, his obsessive rage replaced by the realization that he was no longer the predator in this room. "He saved you?" Daniel croaked, the words wet and desperate. He just found a prettier box for you, baby." Amara raised the gun. Her hands were no longer trembling. The paralyzing fear that had defined her months in Seoul was replaced by a cold, reactive survival instinct that had finally sharpened into a blade. She looked at the faint mark near her eye in the reflection of the glass, the mark Daniel had given her, and then she looked at the man who had claimed her as his own. "You didn't want me, Daniel," she said, her voice steady and absolute, cutting through the erratic noise of their history. "You wanted a mirror to see your own power in. But you forgot that mirrors can shatter." She looked back at Min-Jun. He was watching her with a possessive, protective intensity, his raised hand ready to command the outcome of the moment. He was the dragon who refused to let her go, but in this moment, he was also the mirror she was choosing. The choice was not about Daniel's death. It was about her own irreversible survival. To pull the trigger was to leave the world of white tops and fitted jeans forever, it was to stay in the gilded cage not as a bird, but as the one who held the key. She looked Daniel in the eye for the last time. She saw the monster who had broken her, and she realized he was already dead, erased by the crushing order of the Seo syndicate and the stranger's kiss that had set this path in motion. Amara squeezed the trigger. The sound was a sharp, absolute finality that shattered the silence of the chamber. Daniel Cross slumped forward, the echoes of her past finally silenced by the heat of the Seo fire. There was no erratic shouting, no violent struggle, just the total claim of the dragon. Min-Jun was behind her instantly, his hand sliding up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing away the single tear that she refused to let fall. He took the gun from her unyielding fingers and returned it to his holster, his presence a stabilizing, dangerous force. "The debt is settled, Amara Wells," he whispered, his voice a smooth velvet that made the air in the room feel solid again. "The runner is gone. The outsider is buried." Amara turned to him, her emerald dress stained with the soot of the muzzle flash, her expression calm and emotionally guarded. She looked into the dark, intense eyes of the Mafia boss and realized that she had finally found the safety she had prayed for, and it was irreversible. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice no longer a hollow shell, but the voice of someone who understood the price of protection. Min-Jun leaned down, his proximity a threat and a promise that had become her entire reality. "Now," he said, his possessive claim tightening as he led her toward the elevator, "we show this city who you are." As they ascended toward the cold opulence of the estate, Amara Wells knew the killing choice was just the beginning. She had used a kiss to escape a monster, and in doing so, she had become the consort of a king. The heavy, metallic scent of the interrogation room faded as the private elevator ascended, leaving the echoes of Daniel's final breath beneath layers of reinforced concrete. Inside the small, mirrored cabin, Amara stood beside Seo Min-Jun, the emerald silk of her gown reflecting off the polished walls like a deep, dangerous bruise. She didn't look at the blood on her hands, she looked at her reflection. The woman staring back wasn't the casual outsider in a white top and jeans who had panicked in a hotel lobby. She was someone new, tempered, lethal, and irrevocably claimed by the shadow of the man beside her. Min-Jun didn't reach for her jaw this time. Instead, he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp facial structure set in a mask of absolute, quiet authority. He was no longer just the stranger who had accepted her kiss, he was the architect of her new reality, a king who had watched his consort survive the flames and emerge as steel. "The council is waiting in the library," Min-Jun said, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that no longer sounded like a threat, but a briefing. "They believe you are a liability, a weak point Daniel Cross was meant to exploit to fracture my hold on the syndicate." Amara adjusted the emerald necklace at her throat, her fingers steady. The impulsive survival instinct that had once driven her to run was gone, replaced by a cold, reactive clarity. "They think I'm the bird in the cage," she whispered, her voice no longer a hollow rasp, but a low, steady vibration. "Let them think it," Min-Jun countered, his dark eyes locking onto hers as the elevator doors slid open with a silent, heavy hiss. A dragon is most dangerous when its enemies believe they have found its softest scale. They walked through the halls of the Seo estate, the minimalist glass and dark timber glowing under the moody, warm lighting. The guards, the granite pillars who had once collected her, now bowed their heads as she passed. Amara didn't flinch. She walked upright, her posture no longer suggesting a woman being held, but a woman taking her place at the center of the world. The library was filled with the heavy scent of old paper and the sharp, bitter aroma of expensive tea. 6 men sat around the massive mahogany desk, their expressions as unreadable as the stone walls of the estate. These were the architects of the Seoul underworld, the men who saw people as assets and lives as ledger entries. As Amara and Min-Jun entered, the room went silent. The council members' eyes traveled from Min-Jun to Amara, assessing her emerald gown and her emotionally guarded expression with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. They saw an outsider, a black woman who had stumbled into their world through a mistake. "Chairman," the eldest member began, his voice a dry rasp. "We have been discussing the incident at the gala. The noise created by your guest has drawn unnecessary attention from the authorities." Min-Jun didn't sit. He moved to the window, overlooking the sprawling lights of the city he controlled. "The noise was a correction, Elder Park. A ghost from the past attempted to touch the future of the Seo house. I have ensured that he will never speak again." "And the woman?" another elder asked, gesturing toward Amara with a dismissive flick of his hand. "She is a debt that has been settled. Why is she still within these walls?" Amara stepped forward before Min-Jun could answer. She moved into the center of the room, the emerald silk of her dress shimmering like a threat. She looked at each of the men, her eyes heavy with a power they hadn't expected. "I am not a debt," Amara said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I am the reason your pawn, Daniel Cross, is dead. I am the one who pulled the trigger on the distraction you sent to test your chairman." The elders shifted, their granite composure finally cracking. They looked at Min-Jun, expecting him to silence her, but he only watched her with a possessive, protective intensity. He was no longer the one holding her, he was the one standing behind her as she claimed the room. "She is an outsider," Elder Park hissed. "She knows nothing of our laws." "I know the law of the dragon," Amara countered, stepping closer to the mahogany desk until she dominated the space. "I know that what you intended as a fracture has become a weld. You wanted to prove Min-Jun was weak because of me. Instead, you've proven that he is the only one capable of keeping this city under his palm." She turned back to Min-Jun. He moved toward her, his proximity a stabilizing heat as he reached out and took her hand. It wasn't the grip of a guard or the clench of an abuser, it was the interlocking of two powers. "Amara Wells is no longer a guest of this house," Min-Jun declared, his voice a deep, smooth velvet that filled the library with a crushing, silent order. "She is the Seo sovereign. To touch her is to touch me. To question her is to question the dragon." The elders lowered their gaze, the defeat absolute. One by one, they stood and bowed, not just to the chairman, but to the woman who had used a stranger's kiss to rewrite her destiny. As the room cleared, leaving only the two of them in the moody, warm light, Amara felt the final weight of her transformation. The gilded cage was gone, replaced by a throne she had built from the wreckage of her past. She looked at Min-Jun, the man who had refused to let her go, and realized that she had no intention of leaving. "You knew I would pull the trigger," Amara said, her voice soft but certain. "I knew that once you saw the dragon in the mirror, you would never be able to look back," Min-Jun replied, his hand sliding up to her neck, his thumb brushing the space where the emeralds met her skin. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear, his possessive claim irreversible. "You used me as an escape, Amara. But you stayed to become a queen." Amara Wells turned toward the window, looking out over the Seoul skyline. She was no longer a ghost, no longer a runner, and no longer a victim. She was the silent truth at the heart of the city, the consort who had found her power in the line of fire. The stranger's kiss had been the end of her life, and the beginning of her reign. The dragon and the sovereign stood together, two shadows carved from granite, watching the city they now owned together. This is not the end. It's the point of no return. What happens next will shatter everything you think you know about loyalty, love, and survival, because this story is no longer about escape. It's about what happens after a woman stops running and chooses power. Follow this page and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. The truth is no longer hiding. The dragon has claimed his queen. And the war this kiss started has only just begun.